Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started because I know that this is a precious time because it's between classes and studio and that start at 2. So I would like to get started. So thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Grace Law, and I'm chair of the Department of Architecture here at the GSD. Positions is a series of conversations convened by our department aimed at revealing the positions taken by players on the field of contemporary architecture. The series hopes to unfold the complexity of relations and metaphors to make them explicit and invites faculty and guests to voice where they stand. So today, this actual presentation is also sponsored by the Center for Green Buildings and Cities together with the department. And I'm very delighted to welcome today one of our own, Holly Samuelson. Holly is an associate professor of architecture here at the GSD, and she teaches architectural technology courses. Her teaching and research focus on building design issues that impact human and environmental health. Her current projects harness advanced building simulation to investigate greenhouse gas emissions, heat vulnerability, and indoor environmental quality while considering the future of buildings in a changing electricity grid. Holly she's the co-author of numerous scientific papers, including a best paper awarded by the journal Energy and Buildings. And she has coached multiple winning teams in international design competitions. A recognized expert in architectural technology, she has been interviewed by national and international media outlets, including the Washington Post, the BBC, the Boston Globe, and the Wall Street Journal. And she's lectured extensively at numerous national and international conferences. Before joining Harvard, Holly practiced full-time as an architect and sustainable design consultant. She earned a Doctor of Design and Master of Design with distinction from Harvard Graduate School of Design, so she's also an alum, where she was awarded the Gerald M. McHugh Medal. She earned a Bachelor of Architecture with honors from Carnegie Mellon and was awarded the American Institute of Architects Henry Adams Gold Medal. Please join me in welcoming Holly Samuelson.
Thanks so much. My favorite part of that is that I get to be a player on the field. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Grace, for that wonderful introduction. My talk today is called Architecting Change, Buildings, Health, and Carbon for a Resilient Future. And first, I'd like to thank my funders who made a lot of this research possible. And we have 3 more grant proposals going out today, which is why some of my team can't be here, but fingers crossed that we'll be able to produce even more research. We had a great lecture last week from a number of new faculty, and the theme was relevance. So speaking of relevance, here I'm showing architecture or building design from a time when building design was very relevant. It was the way to produce well-being and comfort for its occupants. So these are 3 very different climates. Let's fast forward to an era when that relevance was given over to mechanical systems. So in Eric Howler's great lecture last week, he mentioned that we're beyond this era. And I find that exciting because now that means that we need to do with architecture what we once did with fossil fuels, and I find that exciting. And I didn't set out for this objective, but I'm going to show you my research, and I think that it helps to show how architecture has further untapped relevance in meeting some of the major challenges in public health and climate change mitigation today. So when it comes to problem solving and eating, I like to go for the biggest slice of the pie. So we've seen this statistic before, but I'd like to remind you that 38% of global energy-related emissions come from buildings. And I'd like to remind you that within that 38%, 70% of those emissions come from heating, cooling, and lighting buildings. So although it might not always be the sexiest of topic areas, this is one of the reasons why I focus on this area, because we still have a lot of work to do. So I care about energy in buildings, but is it specifically energy that we care about, or is it something else? Is it the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the way that we source much of our energy that we use today in buildings? Is it utility costs? After all, if we weren't spending this money on energy, we could be spending it on a lot of other things for humanity. Or is it the health impacts of the way that we generate much of that energy that we use today in buildings? And let me talk about this for a minute. This was a study from 3 UK universities and Harvard School of Public Health that estimated that 1 in 5 deaths globally is caused by fossil fuel emissions. That's 8 million deaths globally every year. Now, you might think that these numbers are kind of aggressive, so we could go back to the prevailing research before this paper came out, which was from the World Health Organization, and it set that number at 1 in 8 deaths annually. So, whichever study you want to look at, fossil fuels are a major public health concern. So, I would like to argue that we need to provide for the health of the occupants of our building, and also those vulnerable populations who are literally and figuratively downwind from the fuels that we burn to operate our buildings. So this could literally mean the people who are living downwind of power plants, which often tend to be not the most privileged of society. They tend to be the vulnerable population to start with. Or we could be talking figuratively about those future generations who will be impacted by the energy emissions that we put out there today. So in my field, we tend to talk about energy efficiency in terms of kilowatt hours per square foot or per square meter. And so let me ask you, look at these 2 pictures. Which of these buildings uses less energy per square foot? Well, probably the one on the right. So by our paper metrics of energy efficiency, that would be the more efficient building. So I'm here to tell you that if you want to make your building more efficient on paper, one of the best things you can do is to put in a big empty lobby and to operate your building for only a few hours a week. But which building uses energy more effectively? After all, we build buildings to house people, to promote our general well-being, not just to efficiently enclose space. So that's something that permeates my work, especially my energy work, and it's something that we should keep in mind. And considering energy without occupant health has not worked well historically. So let's consider architecture after the 1970s oil crisis. And by the way, if you Google ugly 1970s architecture, this picture comes up and I couldn't resist. But okay, 1970s architecture, post-oil crisis, what did we do? We responded by making very deep floor plates so we could minimize that surface area. We made dark, fixed windows, and we dialed back the ventilation rates to the point that this could be called the sick building era in architecture. But consider the opposite. Let's take the first generation of the LEED certification system for buildings, the energy and environment rating system. Considering occupant wellness without energy, and thus global health, hasn't worked well either. It was shown with much embarrassment that a number of the first generation of LEED certified buildings were less energy efficient than their non-green counterparts. And this can be traced back to a few points that were given for daylight and views. Some people might call them overzealous points without caps on the upper limits that promoted all glass buildings and led to this increased energy use and a backlash against the green building movement. So I would argue that considering energy without health has had consequences against the movement in multiple directions. So much of my research focuses today on buildings and health, and that's a very broad topic area, and I get to teach an elective, an advanced elective on buildings and health. But within my research, I narrow it down, and I focus on those issues in buildings that also have a big overlap with carbon performance. So I'm looking for those win-win scenarios, or those big trade-offs, or those big synergies. And so this pursuit has led me to focus, to some extent, on heat vulnerability, or thermal resilience in buildings. So why heat vulnerability? Well, in terms of mortality, heat is the #1 natural disaster in the US on average. Last week, the New York Times wrote an editorial calling for heat waves to be named like hurricanes, and Friday's Washington Post featured this article calling heat the disaster that no major US city is prepared for. So I would argue that protecting our occupants from indoor heat extremes and cold extremes is one of the prevailing critical missions of buildings today and building design today. And I should mention also that heat is an equity issue because oftentimes the impact of extreme indoor heat falls on those groups that can least afford to deal with it. So it's absolutely an equity issue. So let's zoom out and think globally. 1 to 3 billion people are projected to be left outside of the climate conditions that have served humanity well for the last 6,000 years. And if we looked at this hatched area on the map, these represent the 3.5 billion people who will be living in climate conditions that are only experienced today by the people living in that black area. So we have our work cut out for us. So I'm going to talk about a project where we were addressing both energy and heat vulnerability. So in this project, we were developing a framework by us architects that's meant to be used in architecture firms to think about and include energy considerations in that fast-paced early design process. And so what we were showing is how you could simulate numbers of different considerations to see which of them might be the most important, like the shading design, the window size, etc. And so here's some of those results. And we produced a very simple sensitivity analysis method that could be used by architects to understand before they put pen to paper maybe, which are the big decisions that they need to think about in the design. And it turned out in this case, window size was one of the biggest, as well as the selection of glass type. And spoiler alert, these come up over and over and over again in my research as really important design decisions that architects need to make that affect health issues and also affect energy issues. But we also wanted to look at something called passive survivability in this study, and I think that this paper helped to really popularize this term, passive survivability, which is the ability of a building to protect its occupants in a power outage from extreme thermal conditions. And so this was important to us because we had seen the headlines from Hurricane Katrina where hospital staff had to use furniture to break out windows in hospitals because the patients were suffering from extreme high heat after the hurricane when they were dealing with a power outage. And also, two of my co-authors on this paper lived in their apartments after Superstorm Sandy without power for almost 2 weeks. So we think that it's important that buildings be able to provide healthy indoor environments even without power. Now, some of these temperatures might not be a problem for many of us in this room, but these higher temperatures are shown in the health literature to significantly increase risks of stroke, asthma attacks, heart attacks, and especially for vulnerable people who are already sick or who are very old or very young. So that's why we care about keeping these temperatures as close to comfort conditions as we can. It's really a safety issue. So what we did was we put together thousands of combinations of design strategies and we saw which worked well and which didn't. And we also demonstrated this method for quantifying passive survivability in a building. So we're simulating these different buildings and they're moving along fine, and then at that black line is when the power outage occurs. And you can see, for example, that this brown line, which is at the top, those are the indoor temperatures in a minimally code-compliant building. So a pretty good building. But you can see that if we could do better than that with our design by choosing better windows, shading, etc., then we could reduce those indoor temperatures a lot. And that's enough to affect health outcomes. But one thing we also demonstrated was that actually optimizing for passive survivability was not the same as optimizing for energy. So the yellow line and the red line are different here. And that was interesting because that was not the prevailing thinking at the time. The prevailing thinking was that if you design for energy efficiency, you would be designing for passive survivability, but they don't totally overlap. And surprise, surprise, one of the areas where they don't overlap is in window design. So it turns out that more glass tends to be a problem in terms of energy. But more openable area tends to be a benefit when you're overheating and you need to open the windows. So there's a few architects who have thought about other ways to address this, like our Carpenter Center down the road, or this 2226 building in Switzerland, which has openable panels that aren't glazed. Then I'm sure you could come up with other solutions. Or maybe we just need to do more with less. If we have windows, we should make as much as possible of that area openable. So another project we did was we wondered about how does housing impact vulnerability to heat in a population. So many municipalities and governments are trying to map heat vulnerabilities to prepare for heat so that they can allocate resources like planting street trees, like building cooling centers, doing calling campaigns, or handing out air conditioners in a heat event. And so we looked at the different ways that different researchers and organizations are mapping vulnerability, and we looked at what variables are they considering, and that's what we're showing here. And you can see that many of these variables are categorized in blue. They're demographic characteristics, like income and age, which is great. Those are absolutely indicators of vulnerability. But what we noticed is that housing characteristics didn't show up very much, those variables that are in gold. And if I could fast forward to what we found out in our research is that even where they are considered, they're missing some of the nuances of how actually building age and air conditioning availability affects someone's heat vulnerability. For example, For example, the older buildings aren't always the worst buildings in a city. But we wanted to know, okay, so we see that housing is missing from this consideration of heat vulnerability. How much does that omission matter? So we followed all the best practices that we pulled together from literature, and we mapped vulnerability in 2 cities, Phoenix, which is very hot, and Boston, which is where we live. And we found the most vulnerable census tract. So then we documented the housing that shows up in those neighborhoods, and then we simulated them. So we did thousands of combinations of building simulations, and we looked at kind of a mildly hot day and how the indoor heat, the indoor temperatures might be different due to the housing design. And lo and behold, we found that housing matters a lot. So even using this conservative approach, we were able to show a major temperature difference between the quote good housing and the bad housing. And the numbers were enough to, according to the public health literature, significantly affect people's risks of these health outcomes that I talked about, like heart attack and COPD, asthma, et cetera. So we felt that governments were missing this major component, housing, the relevance of architecture to heat vulnerability. So we suggested some solutions in this paper, but it's a pretty hard problem to solve due to the availability of the data. So this problem had been nagging at me for years, and I think just this year, I realized that we have the technology to come up with a better solution. So it turns out that we have access to 550,000 energy models that are statistically validated to represent the US residential building stock. They were never really meant to be run by the public, so they're not the most user-friendly of tools, but over 3 generations of master's students, we've built our algorithms to run these models, and we're the first group to test them, to use them to test resilience. So that's what we're doing here. We're testing the resilience of the US housing stock to a heat event and a power outage. And by the way, these 2 things have a tendency to go together because when the power plants get stressed due to lots of people running their air conditioners, you can have rolling brownouts, you can have conditions like we've had in Houston. So we've seen this before. And the reason I'm showing you the state of Illinois is because Chicago has had a famously deadly heat wave. So what we're showing here is a way that we can map which are the counties that are the most resilient and the least resilient to a power outage heat wave based on the simulations that we ran. So we think that's exciting in and of itself, that we can give this tool to governments to figure out where they should allocate resources. But we also think that there's some rich data here that we can use to probe which buildings are the most resilient and the least resilient and why. And so that's what we're showing here, and we've just started to scratch the surface here. I think we've been able to use machine learning techniques in a number of my other projects to really probe data and find relationships. So I'm really looking forward to finding out more about what in the US housing stock do we need to worry about for these vulnerable populations. And here what it's showing is the somewhat mitigating effect of having an attic. So I was able to present some of this research and findings to a group of mayors and other city officials recently who are very anxious to find out which buildings in their cities are most susceptible to poor outcomes in a heat event. So I was able to show this slide and say who I'm most worried about, just basing on my work and researching this and simulating this. So here's an example. It's a tall building where some people are at the upper floors with the heat rising through. They only have access to windows on one wall, so they can't get cross ventilation. It would be even worse if these windows didn't open very far. It would be even worse if this is a west-facing window, even worse if this is an uninsulated black roof. So that's a starting point of who I would think about if I was the public housing authority, which units I would think about renovating first. And I think with this data set that I just mentioned, we have an opportunity to suss out even more of these details. So we also performed a series of studies that I'm going to just summarize right here, thinking about the co-benefits of building energy and heat resilience upgrades. So architectural upgrades, and what could they do for buildings beyond just saving energy? So one of the things we found is that in our data set of single-family homes, upgrading them, for every $1 in direct utility savings, which, by the way, this is the whole conversation in my world. This is what fuels building upgrades is what's the cost-benefit analysis of that upgrade, how much energy would you save? And so we were just trying to look at, well, if you're a government, then it's not just about cost savings to the owner, it's about cost savings to society. So at that time, we were able to apply the social cost of carbon, but also From the literature, what are the beneficial health impacts that we can quantify? So if my building is not using 1 kilowatt hour of electricity from this coal-fired power plant, there's a certain amount of SOx and NOx and other pollutants that are not entering the atmosphere. And the public health literature has quantified for us what is the dollar savings in terms of asthma visits to the hospital that we don't need, that kind of thing. And so we were surprised to find that in our cases it was 40 cents for every dollar of just what we could quantify at that time. So that was really exciting to show the relevance of these architectural upgrades. We also found that increasing the hours that are comfortable for we also found that upgrades could increase the hours that are comfortable for window use, thus improving indoor air quality. Okay, so think about you're in your apartment, it's a day that starts out cool and it's warming up. Probably in the morning, you're perfectly comfortable with just the windows open and that small breeze. But as it gets hotter and hotter, at some point you think, this is not comfortable anymore, and you close your windows and you turn on the air conditioner. And in most of our apartments, that means we also cut off the fresh air supply. And so we determined that actually if you designed those buildings better in the first place, if they had more insulation and maybe roof window overhangs, maybe even going so far as to having phase change materials in the ceilings and walls like that wax packets that will melt and re-solidify that can really store thermal energy. So if we take any of these measures, then we can actually increase the hours that you can be comfortable with just opening the windows. And so we said, well, that has indoor air quality benefits in terms of chemicals, but also in terms of infectious disease spread. And since this was during COVID, we decided that we would quantify that as well. So that was an exciting finding. And then finally, something that hadn't been showing up in the literature is that we showed that by improving our architecture, we could decrease the outdoor temperatures in summer. So we're talking urban heat island effect. But I'm not talking about surface characteristics like changing to white roofs and white walls. We already knew that. People were studying that, so we purposely left that out of our study. And we were trying to look at this. Actually, I didn't find these images until years later when I was walking through Hong Kong, and I thought, this is an even better case study than the one that we studied. But this is what we're talking about. So you can imagine there's these rows and rows of air conditioners, and they're moving heat out of one apartment. And where are they dumping it? Into that narrow alley, which is heating up, and then making the neighbor's air conditioner work harder. And so we wondered, if we actually made this apartment building better, could we dump less heat? And by the way, due to the laws of thermodynamics, we're making heat while we're moving it. So could I be dumping less heat to the alley, and could it actually change the outdoor temperature enough that we could test it? And we didn't even test it in this narrow alley. It was kind of like this big, wide Phoenix Boulevard. So I feel confident that it would show up even more here. But what we did was we paired the prevailing technology at the time, which was an outdoor canopy model that models all the heat flows. It was validated for Phoenix's climate. And we went back to that vulnerable neighborhood, and we found that, lo and behold, they were planning a public housing development there. So we took the design of the public housing development that was code compliant at the time. We said, what if we made it better, one level, with more insulation, better windows? What if we made it even better by adding phase change materials? Could those architectural changes that have not shown up in the literature actually change the outdoor temperatures? And the answer was yes, it did. So even with wind blowing away the heat, it still changed the temperature at ground level. Not a lot, but enough to register, and approximately the same amount as what you could achieve by switching from black roofs to white roofs, which is considered the gold standard of addressing urban heat island. So we were able to show that basic architectural decisions could be as relevant as changing from black to white roofs. And so we thought that was pretty exciting. But we're not always just working on the computer. So here's a project that we're working on right now that's in India, where we are concerned not necessarily about air temperatures, but it turns out that in a lot of the developed world where it's very hot, you have these sun-baked monolithic roofs that might be metal or they might be concrete. The surface of that ceiling gets very, very hot. And this is especially important when you're laying horizontally in bed right underneath that hot surface. It's affecting people's sleep, it's affecting people's health, and we wondered if there are low-cost interventions available to address this issue that's only going to get worse. So we thought of the marathon blanket. It's so cheap, they hand them out at the end of a race. And what that is, it's a radiant barrier because of that shiny surface that it's trying to stop that exact phenomenon that I'm worried about in these ceilings. So that's one of the things we're testing here. You can see this guy installing it on the bottom image, where we're looking at what if someone just taped up a radiant barrier to their ceiling? Could that help protect you from the heat of these very hot ceilings? And how would that compare to other technologies that we have right now, which is painting on cool roofs, or what if you combine the two? So we're testing all that right now, and the findings are positive. So I think that this is potentially a viable solution. And by the way, it doesn't have to remain ugly like that. This could be behind a finished ceiling, but I'm purposely trying to look at very low cost interventions for populations that need that. And so one of the grant proposals that went out today would be working with other faculty and trying this out in various pilot cities to see how this might work. Another project where we're implementing things in the real world is in Nepal. So one of our great former master's students, Sri Jay Tuladar, went back home to Nepal. And in 2023, there was a major earthquake and a number of families living in emergency shelters through the winter. So Sri Jay took what we worked on, and with Martin, on his thesis, and actually applied it. Dug his thesis out of the drawer and built it. And so what we're showing here is sewing together canvas sacks and filling them with rice husks, which are a waste product. And then, figuring out what should be the exact size of those and shape of those, and attaching them to this bamboo tarp-covered construction. And through a grant from the GSD, I was able to help test how these worked thermally, and it turns out that they worked a lot better than the standard issue or emergency shelters that were given. Now, we think of emergency shelters as being a temporary solution, but in reality, families end up living in these for years. So in preparation for this upcoming winter, we have a grant, and we are producing a number of other shelters to see which designs work best and how can they perform and protect people from the cold winters more so, and also the hot summers, than the prevailing technology today. So I'm really excited about that. And it also includes that radiant barrier on the inside, which is showing here. But coming back to the US, another project that we're embarking on that I'm very excited about, I'm the PI on this project, but I'm partnering with the medical school. And we're interested in vulnerable older adults and heat vulnerability. So we're specifically focusing on adults with mild cognitive impairment. This means that they are able to live on their own, and they do, but they have some impairment. And what my colleagues at the medical school have observed is that these older adults with cognitive impairment don't always take adaptive actions when we think that they should to protect their health. So oftentimes older adults actually can't sense heat, and these older adults with cognitive impairment are additionally not turning on their air conditioning or their fan when you think that they maybe should. And we suspect that there's this exacerbating problem where, okay, you're suffering from impairment, you don't turn on the air conditioner, now you can't sleep, which is a major risk factor for further cognitive decline. So, interestingly, the medical community, the health insurers, have started paying for air conditioners for their at-risk patients. So this is really interesting because the health insurers have figured out that it's cheaper to prevent this heat disaster than to pay for the medical treatment later. So that's fantastically interesting, but those interventions wouldn't help this population necessarily, but architecture would. So that's what we're looking at here. So could we install window shading? When we're on an upper story, could we put in protective radiant barriers and insulation to protect you from that hot roof? Are there other things we can do to, with architecture, prevent these high temperatures in the housing in the first place? And so what I'm showing here in this graph is some of our simulations between the red, which is a typical housing unit, and green if we had designed it for resilience. And there's quite a difference in that temperature, which can affect health outcomes. And so the Boston Housing Authority and architects of senior housing firms have expressed their enthusiasm in actually employing our findings in their future designs. So we're excited about that. And I had an opportunity to talk through these issues with the Washington Post, which they incorporated into these figures for an article about the inequality of heat in India. So I was able to talk about some of these issues that you can see that affect why one family might be more exposed to heat extremes compared to another building design somewhere else. For example, if you're down at the bottom of this urban canyon, you don't get that cooling breeze down there, et cetera. And so I encourage you to check this out. The video doesn't quite do it justice. You get to scroll through and it animates and explains all of these physics phenomenon that are happening. So in addition to heat vulnerability, another area of overlap between carbon performance in buildings and health performance is with indoor air quality. So this is something else that I study. Why indoor air quality? Well, there are 3 million deaths annually from poor indoor air quality, 86 million life years lost annually, and in the US, $150 billion lost in illnesses due to poor ventilation. So just speaking of volatile organic compounds, they increase the risk of diseases such as cancers, asthma, fetal heart malformations. And why indoor air? Well, we spend 90% of our time indoors. And these vulnerable populations are probably spending more time than that indoors. And we know that indoor air can be 2 to 100 times more polluted than outdoor air. So why don't we have good indoor air? Well, part of the reason is because of this energy and health conflict. So it costs money to heat and cool air. And so if you're moving in more and more outside air, that's more and more energy that you need to spend and pay for. And this conflict was something that I got to talk through on this video with the Wall Street Journal, and talking about why we don't have great air quality in our offices today, what we could do about it, and what might be the future of office design. The ventilation in buildings is really interesting. I think we're kind of in the Wild West at the moment. Think of ventilation kind of like walking up to your refrigerator every day and throwing out a random portion of food because you don't know which food in your refrigerator is going bad. That's exactly what we do in buildings today, right? We ventilate the indoor air with outdoor air, but we might not be doing it in the right time, in the right place. We're kind of just guessing. So that's something that I'm working on with Anna and Joanna Eisenberg at SEAS and a group from UNC, where we're developing a new kind of sensor that can better sense the pollutants that are in our indoor air, specifically VOCs, which the industry has a terrible time sensing with accuracy right now. So why is this important? Because we can ventilate our buildings more effectively. And how are we doing this? It's inspired by biology, thinking about the way that dogs sniff. So it turns out that that sniffing sequence of inhaling, holding, exhaling, or inhaling repeatedly actually helps dogs smell, and it actually helps our sensor to distinguish between different pollutants. So we're not advancing this hardware because that's expensive. We're using off-the-shelf hardware, but we're changing the algorithm of how air passes over the sensor. And through machine learning, we can get better and better at changing those patterns. And it turns out that the sensing on the sensor and then the decay over time creates patterns that help us to distinguish between clean air and dirty air. And so why is it important to have an architect involved in this? Because we need to figure out, well, which pollutants should we be studying in buildings and where and why, and what could we do with that information if we had it? So we've targeted K through 12 buildings to start with because of the vulnerable population there. And we've found our list of chemicals that the industry is not good at sensing now and they need to be good at because there are health problems. And so the idea there is that we can sense these in schools and we can and then move on to other buildings, and we can alert the building manager or automatically adjust the ventilation. So in phase 2, we're hoping to work on that. And speaking of that, here's another project, which is as close to a moonshot as I've ever seen in building research. So we haven't gotten this grant yet, but I'm excited and hoping that we do. The idea is to operate buildings in response to sensed pathogens. So think for a minute about your life during the COVID pandemic and what it would have been like, for example, if Gund Hall could have just sensed when COVID was in the air and ventilated it out. Or if it was so bad, told you at that moment it was time to go home. So that's what we're hoping to do with buildings, to be able to sense these pathogens in the air and then automatically adjust ventilation rates or alert people so that we can do something about it in the moment when it's needed. So this has huge implications for public health. I actually think if this works, it could be on the order of impact like developing a new vaccine. And it also has implications in terms of energy savings, right? Because you don't need to be, if we get all of these sensors right, eventually you could be using your ventilation air where it's effectively needed most. So fingers crossed. And again, this is why an architect is needed, because we need to figure out where can we get in the starting round the best, most cost-effective use, where can we reduce the risk the most, save the most energy, et cetera, so we can, it's not going to help real people unless real people can afford to install it. So that's why there's an architect involved here. Okay, so let me bring it back a little bit more to architectural decisions that we deal with every day. So what we do with architecture affects the risk of growing mold in our buildings. Why do we care about mold? Well, mold in homes is correlated to increased risk of allergies, asthma, and immunological responses, among other things. One study showed that the annual health costs of just the asthma that's attributable to dampness and mold in buildings, is costing the US at least $5.3 billion a year. And there's been a number of high-profile closings of courts, schools, and other facilities due to mold. So in an ironic turn of events, in May, the Cambridge Public Health Department had to close much of their own offices due to mold. So all of the remaining employees had to squeeze into their remaining office area, and so they had to rotate which days of the week they could come in. So this is why mold is important in buildings. Now, some of this has been showing up in the literature, and that's not necessarily what I'm dealing with. I think there's something new that hasn't been discussed. So let's think about the way that we design building envelopes. It is dictated by building codes, which are based on a historic definition of climate. So what I'm showing is a very typical New York or Boston wood-framed wall, and the red dashed line is a vapor retarder. And in the 1990s and 2000s, it was either required or encouraged to be a very impermeable vapor barrier. And you would never build this wall with this impermeable vapor barrier on the inside of the insulation in, let's say, Georgia. So what's going to happen to all of these existing buildings when New York, when its climate becomes a bit more Georgia-like? So that's what I wanted to look at here. And it turns out that there's a way we can simulate this. So we can use hygrothermal simulation, which has been around for years. And we can add in a simulation of mold growth, which is based on years and years of empirical studies from a group from Finland. Now, I will admit there's a lot of uncertainty here, so I'm not saying that my results are definitely going to happen. But I'm saying that my results prove out my hunch, which means that maybe we need to investigate this issue more. So what we're showing here is 3 climates, DC, Philadelphia, and New York. And we're simulating that wall in today's climate and future mid-century climates. And what we're showing is a major increase in the probability of mold growth in these walls. And the interesting thing here is that this is not due to climate shocks like flooding and storm events. This is due to the everyday weather, just because the hotter air can hold more absolute moisture. And so this is just the climate stresses, which has not been part of the conversation on climate resilience so far. So possibly it needs to be part of the conversation. Now, our latest paper is coming out soon, but this work was in 2 conference papers, and it was featured recently in Women's Health magazine in their article on mold. So one of the other issues that I deal with, the last one I'm going to talk about in terms of building and health, is simply reducing fossil fuel use, because we talked about how that is a health impact. So this is something that I get to teach in my required classes and my advanced electives. So here's a project from one of my classes that was also entered into an international competition where the team was optimizing their building to perform better. But the interesting thing was that they were kind of asked to just optimize the systems. But they said, no, we're going to back up. We know the relevance of architecture. We're going to redesign the building first. And I think that was how they were able to win this competition. Here's another project from one of my advanced electives. It was the first time the GSD had entered the Department of Energy's solar decathlon competition. And there's a bit of a learning curve there, but I was really proud of this group because they did end up winning an award in their category. Again, using architecture. So they had this well-designed, thoughtful solar chimney. They had an interesting dynamic facade that stretched using pneumatics, ETFE, which would change the solar properties of the facade and let in more heat when they wanted and block more heat when they wanted. And they did a number of other great things in this project. And I'm really proud of this team, and I think while I'm bragging, I should brag a little bit more about Kritika Karbanda. She did a thesis with me in 2023, and she's now the head of sustainability, the global head of sustainability for Henning Larsen Group, which is a 700-person architecture firm known for sustainable design. So I'm really proud of her, and I think that we have a number of students like that have global leadership positions in sustainability. And I think it just goes to show that some of these projects aren't always about the outcomes, but maybe the leaders that they help produce. Although I'm not going to take credit for all of Kritika's successes. But speaking of great students, here was another project where we were taking machine learning techniques from other fields and applying them to buildings. And I think one of my contributions and one of my strong points is to be able to recognize how advanced computational techniques, whether it's machine learning or simulation, can be applied to sticky problems in buildings. So what we were doing in this project, along with Ali McCauley and others, was thinking about how do we control the building's HVAC system and windows. So traditionally, we use what we're calling heuristic controls, which means that there's a set of rules. If it's this temperature, do this. But what we are doing here is saying, aha, there's these new techniques. Let's see if we can apply it to buildings where we can learn over time what works well and what doesn't. So we'll set up a system of rewards and say, okay, if you can produce better energy savings, if you can produce better comfort, you get a reward. And over time, the system learns what works and doesn't work and starts to control the building that way. And so that's what was done here, and it's very exciting because we were able to find 23% energy savings, 80% comfort savings. For someone who works in energy for a long time, it is very hard and very expensive to find these kinds of energy savings in buildings. So this was really an exciting finding. I'm even more excited about this research that I'm going to show now. And I apologize, it's a little hard to explain in the time that I have, but I'm so excited that I refuse to take it out. I think that one of the biggest challenges facing society today is decarbonizing our electricity supply because of the challenge of misaligned energy demand and energy supplied by intermittent renewables like solar. So what I mean is wind, solar, it produces electricity when the conditions are right. That might not be exactly when neighboring users want to use that electricity, and it always has to match or the grid goes down. So we can solve this problem with batteries or major improvements to transmission lines, and we will, and we need to. But we can't solve all of the problems, and we're trying to figure out as a society what to do about that. And I'm here to say that I think architecture can play a significant role, and I don't think this is being talked about yet. If this issue is being talked about in building research, it's mainly focusing on smart building controls. So getting signals from the grid and deciding, do we need to run our clothes dryer right now? And I think this is really important, and we need smart building controls. But I'm here to ask, what about dumb buildings? What I mean is, I think that basic architectural design strategies have a role to play. So things like my students are showing in this project here, like window design and selection and shading, etc. I think that we can provide beneficial electricity demand management while also making our buildings more beautiful and comfortable. To do this, we need to think about what are some of the major changes that are happening in and around buildings. And I'm not sure that all of these trends have made it into the world of building design yet, and I sure know that they haven't made it into the world of building design policy. So some major changes that we're facing is the electrification of heating in our buildings. So we are moving from burning natural gas to heating with heat pumps, and this has some changes. One of which is that suddenly we need to care about winter. So even in cold climates, our electricity grid is most stressed in the summer, and our building codes have been thinking about that. But in about the 2030s, places like New York and New England are going to shift to a winter peaking grid. So suddenly we need to care about winter a little bit more. I would argue that we also need to care about winter a little bit more if we think about the way that these air source heat pumps work. They have to work harder at extreme temperatures. In a cold climate like ours, when are the temperatures most extreme? In winter. So I think we need to take that into account when we're trying to find that sweet spot of design decisions, such as window design. So our window design right now, whether we like it or not, and most of the time we don't, is mandated by a set of building codes. And in a cold climate like Boston, New York, and colder, ideally we would want our glass to let in heat in the winter, and keep out heat in the summer, but we only get to pick one glass. So our building codes have mandated what that maximum solar heat gain that can pass through, they've mandated what that value should be. And it's a sweet spot that's based on historic conditions. And I'm telling you that those historic conditions are changing, and we need to think about that as we build buildings and select this glass that's going to be in our buildings for decades. The other thing is that these building codes tend to be very broad brush, which maybe worked when we didn't care that much. But now that we're trying to solve climate change and we're getting very stringent in our rules, I think that we need to have a finer grained approach to what we're mandating in what buildings. So for example, the building codes only mandate, they have one set of rules for all windows, no matter what orientation they're facing. So here's another student project where they did a great job of thinking about the solar orientation and realizing that windows should be different on different facades. And so here I'm demonstrating that. And the reason I'm showing you this graph is because there's a lot of temporal trends that when you think about these trends together, they have some synergies, some trade-offs, and it has impact. So I'm trying to say that south-facing, equator-facing windows tend to be special. And we're simulating that here, where we're showing across the bottom is the months, and then across the y-axis is the hours of the day. When does a south-facing window let in the most heat? That's in red. And you might expect that it would be in the summer. We have the most hours of daylight in the summer. But actually, due to the sun angles in the glass, it's not the summer. You can see that it might be more like February or January. And part of it has to do with the sun being so low in the sky in the winter that the heat and the radiation is hitting that glass more directly and penetrating through, whereas those high summer angles are glancing off. This is not the same pattern that you would get on an east or a west or north-facing window. This is why I think we need different rules for equator-facing glass. Let me get back to what I was saying about these trends. Another trend is that solar power is expected to grow significantly. So what does that do? What's kind of really interesting to think about the pairing of solar power and windows, because they're both dealing with the same phenomenon, which is the sun. And so what I'm showing now on the bottom is expected grid emission rates. So every hour of the year, you can produce electricity more clean or more dirty, depending on how the electricity is being produced at that time. There are many different ways to express carbon emission rates. This is one of them. It's marginal emission rates. I won't get into that. But you can see this pattern across the bottom, where let's pick Chicago in the middle. We're showing that blue, those hours when the sun is shining, the electricity gets much cleaner than in the off hours when it's red. And do you see a resemblance here between these patterns of when our windows are letting in heat and when solar panels can produce? And if I dove into this further, I would be able to show you that just with normal building materials, our buildings are storing enough heat that if we let in more heat from those windows, we could be reducing that heating load even into the night, even into those peak load hours in the winter. So, okay, when you put all these things together and you do the same methodology that the building codes are using to create the building codes in the first place, but you try out some of these other patterns, you can see that rethinking window design. So in this case, I'm optimizing windows, and I'm going way beyond what's allowed by code in their prescriptive requirements. In these cold climates, like New York and colder, and I'm talking about, in our climate, this is a mandate for single-family houses, and then in our climates and colder, this is for all multifamily housing. If we break code and we let in more heat in our windows, we reduce our heating demand. We also increase our cooling demand, but it has a net benefit even today. So we were able to find in these heat pump buildings, electricity savings up to 6%, and peak load savings, because the peak now on the building is in the winter. So peak load savings of 11%. So again, these are huge numbers that are really hard and expensive to achieve in buildings. So this is looking at today's grid. What if we look towards the future and those anticipated grid emissions rates as we get more solar on the grid? It turns out that it's even better because we are using more energy at the right time. So we still would need batteries, but maybe they would need to be smaller. We only need to store energy for a few minutes or a few hours rather than days. And the marginal CO2 emission savings could be up to 12% in our tested designs. So what does this all mean for architecture? Well, if any of you are an architect working on a residential building of any kind, in our climate zone or colder, talk to me. I don't think you should follow code for your south-facing windows. I think we should do a performance-based simulation approach. I think we should try out different windows that maybe have a higher solar heat gain coefficient. I think you'll save energy. I think you'll be able to have higher visible light transmittance. The windows might actually be cheaper, and we could ultimately save energy and carbon. So, I haven't tested this yet, but I think that we're able to show that we can make south-facing windows net winners again. And so I suspect that we could also allow for larger windows, which I think would make a lot of architects on south-facing cold climate residential buildings make larger windows that could make a lot of architects and building owners very happy. So, I wasn't able to get into all the details of this nuanced analysis, but I was able to give a talk on this that's recorded from the Harvard Vice President of Advanced Learning and the Salata Institute, so I invite you to check it out if you're interested. And I'm very excited that Jim Stock is interested in this research. He's the head of the Salata Institute. He's an economist that thinks about how are we going to achieve all of these solutions across our different industries. And he said something to me that was really interesting. He said, architecture doesn't always have to follow what's happening on the building grid. What you're doing is actually making solar power more cost effective. Because right now, already today, I would say it's either 2 or I think it's 4% of all the nodes on our whole electricity grid and all the hours, we have a negative wholesale price, which means that producers of electricity need to pay money to produce it. Or what they do is just turn off the switch from their wind power or their solar panels because it would bring down the grid. So that's not making solar power cost effective right now. That's not helping. And so what we can do if we were able to use that energy, we could enable solar power to be much more effective and cost efficient. So I think we don't always have to be the chicken, we can be the egg. You know, buildings could be helping to decarbonize the grid and also taking advantage of the decarbonized grid. So I hope that I've been able to show that building energy upgrades aren't always all about utility cost savings and benefits to the building owner, that the additional benefits to society are significant. And before I came to Harvard, I was a consultant on buildings. I got to help improve a handful of buildings at a time. And I think the really exciting thing about doing this research at the GSD is, in a way, we get to be consultants on all of the buildings. So I think that our laws are changing really fast right now, and they have to because of climate change. And I know, Grace, you've experienced this and others, that they're changing so rapidly that we're not always getting them right. And I think that it's important for our knowledge to keep pace. So I think that by doing this research, we can help to influence our building codes, our incentive programs, our zoning codes, so that we can provide the knowledge to get them more right. And I know that I've talked about a number of dire circumstances. I think I've said death more times than one cares to hear in a GSD presentation. But I've been at this for a lot of years, and I've seen our industry kind of crawling towards progress. And actually today, with the new laws, our cities taking the lead and saying, forget you, federal government, we'll take the lead, the technological innovations, this pace of change has accelerated so rapidly that I am actually very hopeful. And I'm very excited to be at the GSD where we can help lead this change. So thank you very much. And rather than end on a boring slide, I thought I'd end here so I could say thank you to my collaborators over the years.
Thank you so much, Holly. This is so helpful because we're actually recording this and live streaming it, so I appreciate that you're talking to the microphone. So you've mentioned so many interesting things, and I really appreciate seeing this sort of broad spectrum of some of the research. When Erica Naginski and I taught Ecofolius, the studio and seminar, we were surprised to realize that actually that there were a number of students who did not have a kind of handle on first principles. And so it was really hard to jump forward and talk about, let's say, like innovative strategies for issues of solar energy and things like that. If, again, some of those first principles that you might have learned in your 8th grade earth science class were missing. And so I'm kind of curious, just to get us started, where do you see, or what do you think are some of the most important first principles that architects that would be a part, or let's say baked into our architectural education in a renewed way? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, that's a great question. I think that having a basic handle on physics is really important because we're trying to then apply those phenomenon to buildings. I would encourage our students not to wave out of our initial classes maybe, and to stick with it and to go through these exercises on heat flow through walls and ventilation and moisture in walls, etc. So I think that we have our prerequisites correct. I think we need to enforce them, and then I think if we go through the introductory classes, I know when I was teaching 6121, which is the first Environmental Systems 1 class, I was really excited to have the students through the first and the second class, which is when I normally teach, which is about HVAC systems and acoustics and lighting and that kind of thing, and really able to say, I'm one of you. I care about these issues architecturally first before we get into these active systems. So I think that that's also a really important class, and Ali Malkawi teaches it well. So I think that that's good feedback, something that we'll have to talk about and think about how we can address. But I think that one of the places that I love to address this is finally when we get the students in building simulation, because I get to have the students play around with software tools, which is not at all about learning the software. It's about playing with these strategies. And I ask them actually to design the best performing building and the worst performing building for their climate, which I think that latter objective is actually both really fun, but also can help us to actually think through these strategies, because you really realize you're not relying on rules of thumb or precedents. You're not having some AI generated building that's based on all of these precedents. You have to design for some new objective that you haven't been asked to before. So it really forces you to think about, well, what's working in a good building? Okay, how can I do the opposite to make it a bad building? And I think that that's one area where I think it's kind of fun to suss out these first principles.
Well, I think relatedly, I'm curious to your thoughts on this. So you express a great deal of optimism for the way in which regulatory frameworks will hopefully catch up with some of the research. Do you think it's the role of the academy to lead on that, and again, how do we precipitate change if in fact the regulatory frameworks are actually not quite where we want them to be? How do we actually push them into that realm?
That's a great question. So I think absolutely a lot of this has to happen in the academy because it's not cost effective to happen anywhere else. And so that's why we work on these projects that are funded by government agencies, et cetera, because no one in industry can afford to pay for this yet, because we really have to think about what are these new trends, et cetera. So I think absolutely the academy is a good place to study this. So my plan, because I do want to change these codes, so we're going to get our peer-reviewed paper out. And then if you look at who underpins these codes, it's this ASHRAE organization. So there's a bit of a political body there that is not just based totally on technology. There's some human beings involved. But it's also based on this one method of testing the improvements to the building codes. And so I'm playing their own game. So I am following their methods and showing, actually, if you take into consideration these new things, using your methods, you get different results. So I think also we can talk to the folks at the national labs that are testing these codes right now, researcher to researcher, and say, hey, have you considered doing this methodology? Maybe you'll find different results. So hopefully these are my plans of real world attack, and hopefully this might work.
Thank you for that. Let me turn it over to those in our audience who might have a question.
Thank you, Holly. I'm wondering, since, as you know, I do a lot of work with existing buildings, and very often you are given certain parameters that there's only so much in sort of tweaking the architecture that you might do. I wanted to ask you really a question about the development of more and more efficient means of using whatever mechanical means you are using to work on the building. In other words, for instance, I live in a house that is hydronic. The heating is hydronic. And I really would like to put in heat pumps, but the technology is not there. I mean, is that something that, is there activity going on to make these things more efficient and more robust to be able to accommodate, which is a fairly substantial need?
So yes, and, okay, so I love this question because it gets right at that relevance of architecture, right? So I tell my students sometimes, you can't just design a bad building and expect that the mechanical systems are gonna save it. Like, you might think, okay, chilled beams are really efficient. I'm gonna put chilled beams in my building. Well, they might not have the cooling capacity to meet your load unless you first design a good building. So you can't get to that efficient system unless you first designed a good building. And then those of us with existing buildings, I looked into putting a ground source heat pump in my home, and it turns out that because of the size of the truck, I could only get one well. So it was like, you have to bring down the load on your house so much that you could heat it and cool it with one well. That's all you're given. And I thought, great, challenge accepted. I'm gonna do this with architecture. And then it turns out that the truck couldn't get in at all. So no ground source heat pump for me, but I think that's part of it, is that some of these more efficient systems, they're only affordable to a certain level, and so you can only get a certain capacity. And so like the Blackstone building that Harvard has, it was an existing historic building over by the Blackstone plant, and they put in valence heating and cooling units, which were, very efficient at the time. But they couldn't just put those in. They had to first insulate this historic brick building. And so they really had to think carefully, how do you insulate a building like this without causing moisture problems, so that they could get to the point that then they had a low enough load that they could meet it with these efficient systems. So it's got to be this balance between dealing with the envelope and then dealing with the systems.
I just wonder how much sort of refinement can still go into it. Does one have to come up with a whole new technology, or is there room in the existing technology? And you may not know the answer to this. It's a very, very specific technical question. But it's been bothering me for some years now because it's something I really want to do and just haven't found a way to do it. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, well, let's talk more because I love these kind of challenges.
Other questions?
Thanks, Holly. That was great. If the federal government came to you and said you can pick your climate zone and we want to hear the single best building intervention you can make that both delivers on benefit cost analysis and the health equity that you've touched on, what would that single intervention be?
Okay, so if we're talking about equity, then we're talking about existing buildings, because often the vulnerable populations aren't in the new buildings. And that's hard because you already have windows. So replacing windows, that's a whole new cost, and the comparison is zero cost. So let me think. I mean, this is so unsatisfying, but I'm gonna be honest. I think we're finding that, to reduce energy use, solar panels are often one of the most cost-effective solutions, and on top of their already effectiveness, we have federal incentives to make them more affordable. So I think that might be one of the solutions. I think maybe you're letting me pick one climate zone, right? Okay, I might pick a very hot climate because I also think thermal vulnerability is really important in cold climates, but we've been dealing with that for years, so that's not a new problem. But, Phoenix is going to be facing climate conditions that they've not faced before. Houston. I might pick Texas because they're great at such a mess that they're pretty vulnerable, unfortunately. So maybe one of my solutions would be white roofs. Or if you have a sloped roof, you can do, it doesn't necessarily have to be white, but it's a cool roof that might look a little darker but reflect the heat. So that might be one. Awnings for windows. If I had more time to think, let me get back to you after I had more time to think about that great question.
Ali?
Ali, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. Question in relation to the code. You spoke a lot about it. What can we learn from the European code or not in the U.S.?
Okay, so I know what you love about the European code is that it's performance-based oftentimes. And what I'm talking about is on paper, let's see how the building performs. And in some places in Europe, they're saying, no, let's see what the building actually uses, which is fantastic. And that's really what we should be getting at. And we are getting a lot more existing building standards in the US that are based on actual measured energy use. So I think there are real advantages to that. I also think that when you're designing a new building, it's kind of hard if there isn't a precedent. And there's no exact precedent that's exactly like your building. Like I talked about, which of these buildings is more energy efficient, the empty one or the really crowded one? And we actually did a study with Harvard residence halls, and we ranked 29 buildings from, quote, best to least energy efficient. And then we added the denominator of per person day. And we realized that the worst performing building actually was fine. It was just crowded and well used. And so this is an example of sometimes why some of those metrics break down. So I think we need really to think about both. So I think we need, we also need prescriptive metrics, which is what I'm talking about, where there's just nobody's running a model. Here's just the rule, you just meet it. And we need that because there are millions of buildings that we're going to be retrofitting, and there's not enough energy modelers to go around. So I think we need both. I think also I've looked at international codes and what they're doing in terms of windows, and they tend to not have, the cold climates tend to not have this restrictive code that I'm talking about, that I'm trying to address. So that's another thing maybe we can learn from other places. Thanks.
Martin.
Thanks, Holly, for a wonderful talk. David left because I actually had a question that I'm not going to ask, which is your views of the trays glazing project. I'm not going to ask that question, so let's forget it. So Ali already went into what I also wanted to go into. So one of the really unique things I think about your work is you're looking at the system level and the building level. So system level as in health insurance, economics, the grid, etc. So that's a really interesting perspective. And
Thank you.
And I learned today that you also do work outside the U.S. But I think most of your work is centered on the U.S., which makes sense because we are here, so no complaints, But is there anything you can learn from other countries? I don't know if it's Europe or Asia or somewhere else, where that interaction between the system and the building is sort of providing you some insights that helps you with your work here.
That's a really great question. And an idea for something I need to look into. So I have definitely looked into what can we learn from other countries, but I don't know that I've necessarily looked into that exact topic of what is architecture learning from interacting with their specific grid. I would say one thing is, for example, Switzerland. They don't need to worry about this problem that I'm talking about as much because they've got so much hydropower. And if you think about it, you can decide when you let water run over your turbine. So in a way, they have got giant batteries. And so that's interesting because they don't need to worry so much about this timing. They can do what they want when they want, and the electricity can be there for them. So I think it's interesting to think that we should not have the exact same codes that Switzerland has when we don't have that situation. But that's a great point, and I have to think about that.
Sharing one microphone. We're very efficient.
I'm going to stay here. I would like to ask you how reliable and accurate are the digital models that you're building versus the real life later?
Okay, that's a great question, and that's actually something that I've really studied in my early work. And so in my dissertation, I looked at lead energy models that were built during the design phase, and then went back and looked at how close were they to actual energy use in real buildings. It turns out not very close. And what were we getting wrong? And so that was the big thing. And so I was able to calibrate the models and figure out what were we doing in the design phase that was a bad guess. And it turned out a lot of it was in occupant behavior. So we assumed that people were going to be doing one thing in buildings and bringing in one kind of plug loads and equipment, and they were doing something else. So I tried to address that. Another place where we were getting it wrong was actually just in the way that the rules were set up in the first place. So it's not like the engineering team didn't know that there was going to be this load in the model, in the building, but it's like it wasn't mandated in the first place to be modeled. So one thing I say to building owners is if you care, ask for the really accurate model that represents your building and is not just, built for the regulatory structure that is under right now. And there's a reason why the codes are like that. So I would say I'm fully cognizant and humbled by how inaccurate these models can be. I still think that they can be fit for purpose and that they can be sussing out relationships that are real and that are important and that we can make decisions on. But I've also shown in my work examples where our inaccuracies in the model are actually changing design decisions. Because I also argue that it doesn't actually matter what our model says in terms of how much energy we're using. That can be off because that's actually not what we're using it for. We're using it to make design decisions. And so I've actually been able to show in my work that there are times when we get something wrong in the model and it's causing us to choose one kind of building shape or one kind of, not that we're really choosing building shape on our energy models, but we're choosing one kind of window when we should have chosen another based on the inaccuracies in the model. So you're right. So there definitely are times when the models can be off. And in that mold study, I am fully admitting that these are new methods. This could be very off. But I'm just saying this is the first step that I think should open the door to say this is potentially a big enough issue that we should now do physical testing, which wouldn't be your first step because that's it's difficult and it's expensive. So let's try it out in simulation first. And if it works there, we know that we need to look harder. So great question.
As part of I'm interested in that question, and I'm just curious if your research is going to take you into improving the software for modeling, and whether or not that's an area that you would, like to delve more deeply into. I'm curious.
Thanks for asking. And that's what a lot of my early research did, and I didn't even talk about it today. And not so much necessarily, although we have at times made tools for window views. So if anyone wants to model the view out of your studio project, come talk to me. We've made tools to design windows better, et cetera. But mostly where we've innovated, because I think with my architecture background and the GST's strength, where we've innovated is to say, okay, here's the actual way that these buildings are being designed. Here are the tools. What are the workflows where we can use them better? So I think a lot of my early work was on trying to improve those workflows in between the two.
In the meantime, between, let's say, the gap of realizing any of the more improved buildings systems that we hope to have, there seemed to be a big group of folks. I'm turning the conversation maybe in a little bit different direction, but there seemed to be a big group of folks that are quite interested in working with the kind of zone of 6 inches from your own body. And that with new performance fabrics and things like that, that actually that there's a critique that maybe we're not, we're mispositioning our efforts because making changes in buildings is so slow. Meanwhile, you can put on a much better high performance fabric and be affected managing, cold temperatures or even hot very quickly. So what are your thoughts on that when people say, well, actually we're not really positioning the research in the right way because we could actually be doing that and it would be cost effective and, again, 6 inch with anything within 6 inches of your body, would affect you very directly. What are some thoughts about that?
I mean, I think that's really exciting and I'm rooting for those people. So I hope they invent those fabrics. I also think that we're starting to look at that in buildings by thinking about, okay, could we have chairs that have fans on them or that are heated? And I'm all for these zoned systems and I'm rooting for them. I think there's also a scale that's in between, sort of this big all building scale and this 6 inches from your body scale that I think is really interesting and maybe doesn't always get enough press, which is with some of the systems that are coming out today. Sorry to get technical, but like these ductless mini splits, you basically they're zoned more granularly than the traditional systems where we're heating or cooling the whole house at one time. And so now it's actually some of the savings that we're getting is not just because the system is more efficient, but because you only need to turn it on when you're in that room and you don't need to heat or cool the other room. So it's not exactly your question, but it's a scale that's kind of like in between the fabric and the building. I think that then we can start to think about what does that mean architecturally? Does that have architectural ramifications, and can we design for that?
Great. One more question.
Thank you, Holly. Really comprehensive, and I really appreciate the Moonshot project. I feel like we're so incremental in this process, to really put moonshot kind of projects out there is incredibly important. And thinking about some of your modeling in even this last conversation, I wonder when you think about like the NREL red stock data set, so this really massive, 500,000 simulations, and even some of the more speculative work in the mold side of things, like we've discussed a 35-degree wet bulb temperature. Like, what are your thoughts there in terms of moonshot? Meaning that what does humanity need to survive when we can no longer evaporate our own moisture off of us, right? So that's another moonshot that I think you're kind of well positioned to take on with some of those data sets and these other theories on mold and moisture. So I'm just wondering, like, speculate a little more, like, could you moonshot that as well?
That's a great question. So you're talking about the solutions for what do we do in those really dire situations?
Sure, or just even the mini split conversation is interesting.
Yep.
We all need to have that room that ensures that we have some active survivability in those conditions, or can passive survivability that you're presenting when we bring in latent heat also. What are the strategies there, maybe?
Yeah, so I think that's exciting and really relevant. Yeah, and actually that's the one, actually the cluster that you and I just submitted last night is thinking about, what are these cities really going to be facing? And with the housing stock that they have, what can you really do? And trying out these different solutions. Are there evaporative cooling strategies? Are there shading strategies? Does it need to be air conditioning? And I think, that's really dire and critical to figure out. I think also it's interesting, one project that I have on the back burner that I haven't had time to, lots of projects I haven't had time to get to was, we have this idea of what is humanly survivable, and that's sort of just, laws of physics. But I would like to look at what is livable in buildings. So let's take into account that people can't be naked and laying perfectly still under the shade of a tree all the time. So that's what those survivable metrics are getting at. So let's take into account old people who are actually in buildings, and the surfaces around them might be really hot. So let's actually find, what are those livable temperatures indoors? And what are those livable no one's done this yet. What are those livable temperatures indoors at different surface temperatures? Because I think that's one of the problems in the developing world too, is like these tin roofs or corrugated metal roofs, et cetera, that's, making the outdoor conditions even worse.
Thank you. I'm very excited about ductless mini splits. Thank you, Holly. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your great questions.